We do appear to have a quorum, so I will call this meeting of the Transportation Policy and Planning Board to order for June 28th, 2021. Reva, if you would please call the roll.
Grant Foster.
Here.
Keith Furman.
Present.
Barbara Harrington McKinney. Eric Sundquist. Randy Udell.
Here.
Christopher McCahill.
Here.
Deanna Satana, sorry.
Here.
Thank you. Margaret Bergamini.
Excused.
And then Bevinath Lankala.
Here.
Thank you.
And then Tom Wilson, one more.
Oh, sorry, Tom. Sorry, Tom.
That's all right. Also here. Thank you. We do have a quorum. Let's see here. Approval of minutes from our June 14th, 2021 meeting. Assuming all board members have had a chance to review those if they so chose, is there a motion to approve?
To approve.
Thank you, Badri. A motion, is there a second?
Second.
Second by Randy. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving our minutes from the June 14th, 2021 meeting, please unmute yourselves and say aye.
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 Opposed, no. Chair believes unanimous. If you'd like to register a no vote, please raise your hand. Seeing no hands raised, that will go down as unanimous. I don't believe we have any items for public comment not on the agenda. So are there any communications, disclosures, or recusals from members of the board? Seeing none, we'll dive right into our first item then for the evening. Legistar 66134, Working Draft Division 0 Action Plan.
Okay, good evening, everyone. First, I want to thank the board for the guidance on the Vision Zero initiative. Staff team has been working very hard on this, and we made a lot of progress. So we're at a point that we can present the first draft of the action plan for the next 10 years. And we call it the rough draft of the action plan. So there is a lot of good stuff in it, but still there are some components are missing. For example, especially the engagement portion, as COVID has created a lot of challenges for that. And we started doing that, as you all know, but still a lot of work to be done on that. So the purpose of this is to present this to the board early on and get input and feedback early to make sure that we are on the right direction. And we'll continue to bring back updated versions of the action plan in the next few months and work with the board to finalize the plan. So I think everyone have seen Ali a few times now, but I want to introduce a new member on the team, Annabelle. So she is our Aspire intern for the summer. So she attends Smith College, but she's a lifelong Madisonian. So very familiar with our community and our city. So she has been helping us with the Vision Zero initiative and also the LED streetlight conversion project. So she has done an outstanding job for us so far, and especially the document production for the action plan, as you probably have seen already. So without further ado, I will pass on to Ali and Annabelle for the staff presentation, and other members, Tom, I saw Tony, and Jim and I will be here help answer questions. We also have a few of you are quite involved through the process, such as Alda Foster and Chris. So I'm sure they will help to answer some of the questions as well. So Addie and Annabelle.
Okie dokie, I can get us started. Hello, everyone. Like Yang mentioned, I've been working on this Vision Zero action plan. Most of my work has been on formatting this document and also creating the beginning sections in order to provide context for the strategies and actions that our subgroups have been working on and that we are proposing. I know that everybody has had the chance to look at the document if they wanted to, but I just wanted to give a very brief overview of the beginning sections before Allie goes on to discuss the strategies and actions. Okie doke. So this is the just the cover page and the table of contents. And we can head right into the next slide, Allie, if that's okay. So we begin with a letter from city leaders. In order for a city to be recognized by the Vision Zero network, its leaders need to make a commitment that is both public and official. In addition to having public announcements from mayors, many cities include an official letter in their action plan to further prove their commitment. So we have space for one in ours as well. Next is a dedication. This dedication is meant to provide meaningful context to the action plan. It's easy to get lost in the details of this document, but it's important to recognize why we're doing this by taking a step back and acknowledging the lives that have been lost to traffic collisions on our streets. And then the next section is kind of an overview of why Vision Zero, why we're implementing this, why we're shifting our focus in our transportation system. It begins with the history of the movement and its growth in the US. We can go on to the next slide. Next, it explains how Vision Zero differs from traditional approaches to traffic safety. For example, Vision Zero focuses on changing systems and road design rather than relying on individual drivers to make perfect decisions on the road. The next part of this section outlines why Madison needs Vision Zero, because an unacceptable amount of Madison residents experience severe crashes every year. And the future of Madison as a growing city that values multimodal transport and the health of its residents rests on our ability to rethink the purpose of our transportation system. Are we designing for cars or for people? Let's see. And then after detailing Madison's current commitment to Vision Zero, this section ends by explaining where this action plan fits into the city's long-term goals. While it's not meant to be an all-encompassing list of everything that must be done to transform our current transportation system, this action plan will allow Madison to make substantial progress towards its target of zero traffic deaths and life-altering injuries by 2030. This timeline by 2030 brings necessary urgency to this plan, and our goal of fully eliminating deaths and severe injuries may seem aspirational and really bold, but it's really essential. And then the next section is the guiding principles of Vision Zero Madison. It begins with a section on prioritizing safety, because instead of trying to make it safer for personal vehicles to move faster or reduce travel times, we're focusing on safe mobility for all roadway users. Prioritizing safety includes allocating limited public space, resources, and transport to those who need it most, including pedestrians, bicyclists, and those riding public transit. I don't think they're shown, but we also have a part that discusses data and a discussion of how we are integrating equity into our action plan. Okay, and then our data section is still being developed, but it currently presents our interim high injury network, an analysis of crash factors, and some demographics of those involved in severe and fatal crashes. I wanted to keep this overview brief to let us save as much as end. Action section, I'm going to hand this over to Allie, but if anyone has questions about the beginning sections, feel free to ask them after the presentation is over.
All right, awesome job, Annabelle. Now I'm going to be talking about the strategies and actions section. We used the following factors in our safe systems approach and came up with these factors. So the first one is safe streets, safe people, safety data, safe vehicles, and safety-focused enforcement. And so I'm going to briefly go over all the strategies for each section or group, and then also give you examples of some of the action items for some of the strategies in those subgroups. So I'll start with safe streets, and those strategies are number one, create safer streets through speed limit reductions. Number two is make safety improvements systematically on high injury network streets. Number three is improve street lighting to increase visibility regardless of transportation mode. Number four is incorporate Vision Zero into project selection. Number five is close gaps in pedestrian and bicycle network. And lastly, secure increased funding for implementing Vision Zero strategies and for long-term maintenance of improvements. And so here is an example for safe streets in the action items. So for each section, it will, or in the rough draft action plan, for each section, it will be strategies, and then it'll be a list of action items in this table format. And so list all the action items, the timeline for that action item, cost, which is demonstrated by dollar signs, goal, lead agency on that item, and partners. And so here's an example for the safe streets. I just took that first strategy and used or picked one action item just to show for this presentation. And that item was 20 is Plenty program to reduce the default speed limit to 20 miles per hour. And then another strategy also with that action item below. And then next is safe people. And those strategies are develop materials to educate and communicate to city staff and key stakeholders. Number two is build a traffic safety culture in Madison. Number three is expand safe routes programming and walk bike travel education. Number four is expand and support alternatives to driving. And so again, here's an example of that, like an action item for the safe people subgroup. So I took that first strategy and listed two action items. An example is create a guide for public information officers to guide communication around Vision Zero. And so those action items are, actions that correlate to those strategies under those subgroups. And the next is safe vehicles and safety data. And those strategies for safety data are improve city data transparency and communication, and use data to direct funding and resources. For safe vehicles, number one is encourage and promote vehicle safety technologies when purchasing vehicles. And number two is train drivers to make the best decisions available to them using defensive driving strategies. So an example for safety data, I used the first strategy as well and took one action item or two action items. And one is work with public health to incorporate emergency room data and Vision Zero data. And the next is safe vehicles. Took that same, the same first strategy and just gave an example for that first action item. All sedans, pickups, and vans that the city purchases will include backup cameras and ABS. So that's an action that correlates to that strategy. So. Lastly, safety-focused enforcement strategies. Number one is coordinate engineering, education, and enforcement activities so that MPD can focus traffic enforcement at times and locations to have the greatest impact on reducing unsafe driving and serious crashes. Number two is limit use of pretextual traffic stops and implement clear guidance on their appropriate use. Three is prioritize hazardous driving behaviors as a motivation for traffic enforcement and deprioritize citations for non-hazardous and discretionary offenses. Number four is support non-citation outcomes for non-hazardous violations and restorative justice for minor traffic offenses, along with programs to reinstate driver's licenses. Number 5 is implement a training program for officers regarding traffic safety and implicit bias and hold officers accountable for instances or patterns of biased behavior. And lastly, advocate for changes to state statutes and funding that would improve its ability to advance the goals of Vision Zero. And here's an example of an action item for the Safety Focused Enforcement Group. Here's the first strategy, and an action item is identify priority times and locations for traffic enforcement and establish enforcement benchmarks to include in quarterly reports. So those are examples of the strategies. All the strategies were listed, and then it just gave those an example of an action item. But that is our presentation. We will take questions now.
All right, thank you, Annabelle and Alexandra. We do have one registered for public comment before we get to questions from board members. We have Bob Schaefer. Bob, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
All right, you've got 3 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
Okay. One of the things that's important to consider in this is that you can't design for cars because cars don't do anything. It's the people who drive the cars and people who walk and people who do other things. And that one of the problems that we encounter is that we tend to use the same square foot of surface for a number of different uses. And that creates problems. And that when we're talking about education, that all the education that you put on there seems to me to be focused on the drivers, and all of the enforcement seems to be focused on the drivers, meaning the drivers are always the cause of the accidents. And that there have been incidents where pedestrians have stepped out into traffic. There have been incidences where bicyclists have run stop signs. And I've encountered this on several occasions where they've even run traffic lights. So that it's not just a one size fits all result in this. The only way that we can achieve net zero is by separating the modes of travel. And one of the things that has been proposed to the city is using a personal rapid transit system that operates 20 feet above the street level called Transit X, which has its objective is to create net zero, because that the operation of the vehicle is not at any time in contact with bicyclists or with pedestrians and other things because of the way that it operates. So that one of the things that we need to look for is that personal rapid transit has been around for about 50 years. Not in this particular format, but it has been around and the technology is there. The problem is that the city doesn't even want to look at it. And so that we aren't going to make any progress if we don't look at emerging technology, and if we don't look at things that, one of the things that PBS had on a few weeks ago was the concept of flying vehicles that were that operated by a computer, not by the person that was occupying it. So we can either look at having all these vehicles floating around somewhere in our space, or we can look at least considering the concept of looking at 21st century technology and at least talking to the people and getting a good understanding of how that would affect the community. And that we can't move forward, we can't achieve net zero if we're only focused on the automobile, because it's more than just the automobile that is involved in that. And the more that you reduce speed limits, the more frustrated people get when they know that it's possible for them.
All right, Bob, you're at 3 minutes. If you could wrap up quickly, I'd appreciate that.
Okay, I think I've said enough.
All right, thank you. Any questions for the speaker? Seeing none, questions for staff? Alder Foster, go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. In the Safe Streets strategies section, which is probably the section that I'm sort of the most hopeful for, and I think other communities have found the most success with that side of it. I'm wondering, was there discussion about other engineering strategies outside of speed limit reductions? I was a little surprised that that was the one that was in there, but it seems like I'm not sure where other things like bump outs, narrowing crossings, tightening up turning radius, so like all these other kind of roadway geometric interventions would fall in there. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so the speed limit reductions isn't the only action item under, so if you look at the PDF that was in the, that was sent out, there's a lot more strategies and action items. It's not just speed limit reductions.
So the 6 that are in the presentation are not, you just pick 6 of them out, or?
Yep. Maybe, so, Allie, why don't you share?
Yeah, I was just doing that.
Share document. Yeah, it goes to strategy number 2. There are many good examples from there.
You know what page?
So we can start with page number 27. That's a page marked on the page, so it might be 28 if you look at a PDF document.
Yeah, so here's the Safe Street section. So it talks about, speed limits, of course, and then the high entry network, and then, street design in general. Let's see.
Yeah, so I guess this does match what you have in the presentation. So there's 6 strategies, and each strategy has multiple actions. But I guess, so, reducing speed limits to me is one pretty narrow thing, which I think is great. We've started doing that. But I guess I'm looking for, potentially, I guess, under number 2, where it says make safety improvements systematically on high entry network streets. But where my mind is going is a lot of the projects that come up at Transportation Commission, for example, and the discussions we've been having at the traffic calming subcommittee is around trying to build in sort of the most current thinking around safe street geometries into our new projects and reconstruction. So yeah, like we've started to see engineering actually propose things with bump outs from the get-go, which is a really great safety improvement. And I'm not sure where in the 6 strategies in safe streets that would fall under. So I guess maybe I'm suggesting is maybe instead of speed limit reduction being the strategy, maybe that should be broadened out into more, other kinds of safety improvements on roadways, of which speed limits would maybe be one, but other kinds of changes in how we design and construct our streets seems like might be worth having at a high level in that section. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Definitely will write that down. I get your point.
That's definitely a great point. Yeah, we can think about separating those things out and maybe putting a dual strategy. So right now, I think it's kind of scattered around, especially in strategy number 2. So different things that we can do to. I think now we focus primarily on existing streets, the high entry network. But maybe new streets, or even if not the high entry network, but the standard city streets, how can we build in more safety features into it? I think some of those we mentioned that in section 2, such as I think we mentioned RFBs, for example, curb ramps. I think we mentioned some crossing treatments as well. But definitely, I think general street design could be one strategy as well. So that's a good point. We'll think about how to maybe separate some of those things out and highlight those.
All right, thank you. Chris McCahill, go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks for bringing this here. I know this came together really fast, so it looks really great. And I appreciate that we're seeing this sort of in a really rough form like it is now, because I think it's a good opportunity to look at some of the things like Alder Foster just mentioned. And I think that that one point is sort of an example of something else that I see sort of happening throughout the document, mainly because of the process through which we got here, which is a bunch of working groups sort of working separately, and then all that came together into this document. So hopefully there's some work that can still be done to turn it into something more cohesive, like from a higher level. So I think that example of the safer streets piece is one example of that, where maybe well, let me take a step back. I think, this document is as much an action plan as it is like a communication document, So I think we want to be careful that, when this document goes out here and people look at the safe streets section, it communicates there's two in that section, maybe I'm wrong, but that this document communicates, our top two sort of priorities or recommendations in a very clear way that captures like what we were just talking about. Like, it's not just about speed limits. There was many more than two here. Sorry. But some of the other sections had two. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. And I looking back at what the I think I can call out the enforcement group, because I was sort of helped spearheading that. Like, the messaging around the recommendations that came from that group is very different than the recommendations that came out of other groups. Some are very simple and sort of easy to digest, and some are very complicated and detailed. And so hopefully there's going to be a way to sort of tie these things together with a common language, and maybe even go back to the groups a little bit and say, is this what you were going for? If we want to, sort of retool things to create this more comprehensive document. So that's maybe I was rambling a little bit there, but that was kind of my initial reaction.
So if I were to repeat back what I think I heard you say, Chris, so that Ali and Yang and everyone, it seems to you that it's evident that there's many different authors of this. And if we could make sure that, let's say, the four different authors agree with each other, and that none conflict. And I think you were right that four of the strategies are very, I'm going to say, very directive oriented, action oriented with short sentences. And let's say the enforcement section have more complicated ideas, and it's long, right? And that's kind of, so if we could kind of right size both sections, right? So that it's consistent. I am going to say that the enforcement section, it's a nuanced and challenging section, but I see what you're saying. I think we see what you're saying is that kind of look through them. Do they sound the same? Are they the right size? And then there's the consistency. Do they complement each other? And then if I go back to Alder Foster, which I think Alder Foster's was really good, maybe coarse refinement, that let's make sure that we have the right things. And if we have worded things incorrectly and we want it to be broader or to incorporate more things, we should do that. Did I say that right?
Thank you, Tom. Perfect.
All right, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Tom. Alder Harrington McKinney, you're up next. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Chris, I appreciate you saying that, because as I went through the document, being a new person that's sitting at the table, I was trying to determine what is the the action cohesiveness, what is the thread. And what I found myself realizing is that because I was not on those earlier conversations, I was losing the intent. And when we are presenting this as a powerful document, it is very important that that intent is consistent in those categories that they can be consistent in. And so that was, and I wanted to acknowledge you and thank you very much for bringing that out, because as a new person sitting at the table, I felt so disconnected because I was not a part of the earlier conversations. But in the reality is that those elders who will be reading, or this document will be reading it, they did not have the privy of sitting in those earlier conversations. So it is that language and that connection that is very, very important, so that that carries throughout the document. That was my input. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder Harrington McKinney. Alder Foster, go ahead.
Thanks. One other point I wanted to raise, it came out of discussions at the traffic calming subcommittee as well, as this tension between what we could do maximally to make our streets safe, and then the competing tensions that are maybe getting in the way of that. And one of those things, for example, would be on-street car parking, right? Like there's this tension on the Whitney Way project between, okay, well, we know buffered bike lanes are going to be safer, but then there's this competing interest of people wanting to have a place to store a car. And so we sort of know about that and we talk about it, and it comes up during specific projects at TC. But I'd love to see that called out really clearly in our Vision Zero strategy. And I think, and I would hope that we are really assertive about if we're truly going to take on Vision Zero, and if we truly are going to prioritize as number one safety, I think we should be really clear that that is going to require making those conscious decisions. And that means we are going to perhaps lose some space for car parking, perhaps throughput on streets is going to be reduced, travel times might go up. So I'm thinking kind of big picture. That's one, I think, big theme in those places that have actually done a really strong Vision Zero initiative. I think they've been really honest with the community, and they feel like they have the support and the backing of the community to do whatever it takes. And so really like starting at that place with roadway design and saying, okay, how can we design the safest possible street? And then having conversations, okay, well, are we going to be satisfied with that motor vehicle throughput? Are we okay with, we're going to have a longer ped cycle on here, and it's going to make the intersection, quote unquote, function, more poorly from motor vehicle perspective. I think that's in practice, that's what's getting in our way often of making the decisions that would be the sort of the safer one. And I think this Vision Zero document is a place to really be honest about that and be clear that it's not gonna happen for free. We can't both take Vision Zero seriously and do everything we need to in that direction and keep everything else the same. Like it's gonna require those trade-offs.
Thank you, Alder Foster. Are there any further questions for staff or comments on the document, on the working document? All right, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, can someone just remind me the timeline we're working on now in terms of next steps and finishing up?
Sure, I can answer that. So as you remember that we studied the kind of the final adoption of the action plan till March next year. So between now and then, we are planning on to making the document better and keep bringing the document to the group for feedback for guidance, and hopefully after some iterations of the process, we can land in a really good process. But hopefully, it's our goal that we can have a really solid document by end of the year, so that we can finish the process in the early 3 months of next year. So that's kind of the timeline we're looking at.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Yang. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I think I just want to add that, we have our 5 strategies, right? But we have many actions that we may not have all of the actions that should be considered, right? And so, we loaded this into Legistar on Friday. You may look at it, but if an action comes to mind over, the next month or something that is not on our tables and you feel like has merit and should be considered, please kind of let us know. As Yang said, this is a rough draft. I think it was good to present it to you because we were able to kind of make this a document that the board would like and that the city needs, right? And so you can provide, if you have other comments that should be incorporated, why don't you pass them along to staff?
Thank you, Tom. Are there any additional questions or feedback for this working draft? Tom or, Alexandra, Annabelle, any other staff, did we answer anything that you wanted us to provide or give you the feedback that you were looking for? Anything outstanding? Not seeing anything. All right, well, thank you again for bringing this to us. We do appreciate it. All right, then we will move on to Legistar 66135, our organizational meeting. So our organizational meeting, in other words, is this: we need to elect a chair and vice chair. So the city ordinances that govern this body require us to hold that election at least every 2 years, and it's been about 2 years. So the current chair is myself, Tom Wilson. The current vice chair is Alder Foster. This is, I believe, the only board or committee in the city that does allow alders to serve as chairs and vice chairs, which is why Alder Foster is able to serve as the vice chair. So that said, I will open the floor for nominations for chair or vice chair. Alder Furman.
I'd like to nominate Tom Wilson for chair.
Thank you, Alder Furman. I accept that nomination. Alder Harrington McKinney.
Oh, I have a question, and where do I interject it? This is just a question of a process.
Go ahead. You can ask it now.
And so you had said that this is the only committee where an alder could serve as chair or co-chair. Could you give me the rationale behind that and how this separates it?
I'm not quite sure the reason why, at least not off the top of my head, why that was chosen. I'd have to maybe dig through the ordinances again. I just know that it is unique. Alder Foster maybe shed more light on it. He was heavily involved in that torque process that created that TPPB. I see his hand up. So why don't you go ahead, Alder Foster?
Yeah, and it's probably available in the torque report, but from my recollection, it was essentially because when the TPPB was imagined, it was imagined to be this very sort of high-level policy body, and they with heavy input from the alders, and so there was conversation about it, and they specifically wrote in to the ordinance that they wanted alders to be available to be able to serve as chair or vice chair on it. So I think it's just generally because of kind of the nature of it that they intentionally did that. I guess I would just also clarify there are other bodies like Finance and Common Council Executive Committee that do have chairs and vice chairs as alders.
Okay, thank you. And so I don't equate the council president and council leadership as in that category. So if it was written into the ordinance, I'll go back and look at it. I do have a question about that consistency, because if in other boards, committees, and commissions, alders are not to serve as chairs or co-chairs, I would have questioned with this consistency. And so I would recommend that an alder not serve as chair or co-chair, and then that position be allocated to someone who is a member of the a resident member of the committee, and not an alder.
All right, thank you, Alder Harrington McKinney. So yeah, the exception obviously is groups that are staffed primarily by, or I should say positions are filled by alders only. Then of course you do have chairs and vice chairs who would have to be alders. But I believe this is the only one that has resident members that has that specific rule. I could be wrong, but that's my understanding. In any case, it's allowed for the TPPB. So we do currently have one motion, I'm sorry, not one motion, but one nomination that's been accepted. We still need, the floor is still open for nominations for chair or vice chair. Chris McCahill.
Well, I'll just second that nomination. I think that was still needed.
Okay, thank you. Alder Harrington McKinney, your hand is still up, so if you'd like to, unless it was up from before.
Yes. Could you remind me who the nomination for chair was?
It was for me to continue as chair.
Okay, and who is the current vice chair?
Alder Foster.
Okay, so I would like to nominate Randy for vice chair.
Randy, would you accept the nomination for vice chair?
I would accept the nomination for vice chair. Thank you,
okay.
Alder McKinney.
So we have a nomination for a chair and nomination for a vice chair. Is there a second for that nomination for vice chair? Alder Furman? Okay. I need a second for that nomination. Badri, looks like a second. Okay, are there any other nominations for chair or vice chair? Alder Furman.
I'm going to nominate Alder Foster, and at some point I'd like to speak to my nominations as well.
Okay, is there a second to that nomination? Badri, looks like a seconding again, thank you. Are there any other nominations for chair or vice chair? Okay, seeing none. Alder Furman, if you'd like to speak to your nomination, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'll speak to the easiest, which is my nomination of our current chair. I think Tom has done a fantastic job with this committee. It's been incredibly difficult to figure out how to be organized with so much on our plate, and I really appreciate how well Tom has done that, and I'm eager for him to continue. As far as nominating Alder Foster, I'm also open to other ideas. I do want to say, when it comes to nominating Randy, who I was very pleased to have met in person recently, he is a member from outside of Madison, and so I think if we're going to have a vice chair, my preference would be a vice chair from the city of Madison. If it's not Alder Foster, maybe we reopen the nominations. But I appreciate Randy volunteering. That's at least my opinion. I do think when they looked at these committees, they were very intentional about allowing alders to be part of chair and vice chair. It's obviously up to us as a committee whether or not we want to do that. And so that's my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder Furman. Are there any, so the floor is still open for nominations. Are there any further nominations? Randy, go ahead.
Given that strong argument from Alder Furman, I would like to withdraw my acceptance as far as nomination for vice chair.
Okay, thank you, Randy. So we currently have 2 accepted nominations, 1 for chair, 1 for vice chair. Are there any further nominations for chair or vice chair? Alder Harrington McKinney.
Okay, I would like a point of order and like to speak to why, and I know that we are in the nomination process, but I want to make sure that I speak to why I nominated someone other than Alder Foster, who is absolutely capable. It has absolutely nothing. I think he and Chris are well capable of being vice chair. So that is not the issue. My issue is that for as a policy body, the position of chair and vice chair had been from residents on a board, committee, or commission, and alders were not to serve as chair or co-chair. And for that exception to be written in to this ordinance for this particular body deeply concerns me. And I would, because alders is currently a 2-year term, there's a lot of transition, but it is the resident community input that is so critically important. And I would like to see, and that is why my nomination for Randy, and Randy withdrew. And I nominated Randy because if I had nominated the person that I wanted to serve as vice chair, I'm sure that I felt that he would not have accepted. But please make that consideration is that if it is the policy and consistency in terms of boards, committees, and commissions, that the alders do not serve in that capacity, then I think that we should be consistent with that as well. If it's written into the ordinance and we need to take a look at the ordinance and it's not in order at this point, I have some strong concerns about having an alder serve as president or vice president in this capacity.
Thank you, Alder Harrington McKinney. So it is written into ordinance, and it would not be the authority of this body to change that ordinance. It would take, I believe, the city council to do that. Foster, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, speak to the nomination for me to continue as co-chair. I'm very happy to continue to do that. My thinking around the duties and responsibilities for chair and co-chair, I mean, the chair has a lot of responsibility to just manage the meetings, and I really also agree that Tom's done a great job with that for us. Really, the only role of the co-chair, other than filling that responsibility if the chair were to be absent from a meeting, which I don't think has ever happened since I've been in this role, thankfully. Really, the only other responsibility or role is to help with the agenda setting process. And I actually would say I'm glad that those alders that worked on the ordinance rewrite had that conversation and they decided to open that up to alders. I do think that when we're thinking about our board, committee, commission structure, it's actually very helpful to have alders really integrally participating in that work. And I think for me, it's been really helpful to be sitting in on those agenda setting meetings and really, have been just really working with Tom, both Toms, to try and make sure that our agendas have items that are good for discussion for all of us and kind of keep us on track. And for me, it's been a rewarding opportunity, and hopefully no one has felt like I've used that position in any way that would be inappropriate. So I'm happy to continue that if all of you support me.
Thank you, Alder Foster. So the ordinance also says that we have to have the elections at least every 2 years, but there's no restriction on how many we have. So if there is turnover on the council, if there are changes that need to be, we can have additional elections anytime that we want to. And of course, any board member can influence the agenda by communicating with myself as well. So, or just at the end of a meeting when we talk about general items, it's also an appropriate time. So. Okay, before I close the floor for nominations, are there any further nominations for chair or vice chair? Seeing none, I will close the nominations. Is there any objection to handling both votes or both nominations with one vote? Okay, seeing none. Seeing none. All those in favor of appointing Tom Wilson as chair of the TPPB and Alder Foster as vice chair of the TPPB, please unmute yourselves and say aye.
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 I abstain. One abstention.
Okay. Opposed, no. Chair believes it's all ayes with one abstention. If you'd like to register a no vote, please raise your hand. Thank you. That is done. Thank you all for your, vote of confidence. I have enjoyed being the chair for the last, I think, 3 years now, and look forward to the next year or 2 years of working with staff to bring agendas and forward our policy goals. All right, our next item for the evening then is Legistar 66136, Metro Transit Fare Study. We're going to get an introduction summary.
Yes, so Justin would be the right person to detail some of this work. However, he's on a much deserved vacation with his family. So I'm going to introduce it, give some of the background and the backbone of it. There'll be ample opportunities for the board to weigh in and the public to weigh in over the next couple of months. I think Justin gave a kind of the outline of it in May. At that point, the report was really in a rough stage, did not have as much content. The report has been revised and updated, and it's posted in the Legistar. It's not all encompassing, but it provides a good background. So I'm going to start. I'm going to share my screen. And then I'm going to do my summary. And if you have questions afterwards, I may be able to answer them. And if I can't, then I'll just say you'll have to ask when we have other staff available. Okay, the first thing we want to look at is fare free. I think that's been, there's been many commenters and registrants that have said, can we go to a fare free system? And it's garnered recent attention, both during the pandemic and prior to it. Chapel Hill implemented, it's a little bit different at Chapel Hill, but because it's fares represented a smaller portion of their budget. They are studying resuming fares. I don't know the status of the study. The Kansas City Area Transportation Authority is the largest city so far to have implemented it. For that, the fares represented less than 10% of the budget. Much of the fare replacement, about 50 or 60%, has come from Kansas City itself. So Kansas City, I think, had allocated about $4.5 million to go towards the fare replacement of this system. And it appears as this system is kind of implementing fare free incrementally, route by route. Europe has more examples, Estonia, France, and Luxembourg. However, while there's many examples in Europe, it's not necessarily a universal thing. It's just, choices by those communities, of certain communities. Fare-free typical impacts, the benefits are reduced barriers. Anyone can get on the bus anytime and go anywhere. That's huge. You think about it. In fact, my son has some friends, and while we were going fare-free during the pandemic, some of them personally thanked me for going fare-free. They said, this is great. And it has a potential to increase ridership and reduce administrative costs. However, the challenges include loss of operating revenue. There can be a ridership gain. But sometimes that ridership gain is not necessarily from auto users, but I guess some of the literature states that some of it's from biking and walking. So people are going from active transportation to transit. Some of the studies suggest that if you go fare free, sometimes you need additional service for capacity. And there can be increased security challenges. I think perhaps one of the poignant issues of this has to do with fares and the way Metro Transit is funded. This is a little graphic from the annual report for Metro from 2019. So that budget was about $57 million. Fares comprise about 24% of it, of Metro's revenue, about 18.5. So if we eliminate fare collection, which is discussed in that report, we could probably see a cost savings of about $500,000. So pre-COVID, federal and state operating systems had remained stagnant. So let's just go with that for the moment, okay? So that means that if there's if you look at the orange portion of that graphic, the federal and state assistance remains stagnant. Then if you eliminate the orange portion of that graph, it has to be accommodated by the blue portion of that graph. So what ends up happening is it's not like everyone, that 24%, if we eliminate that 24%, everyone just absorbs a little bit more of the operating costs, but instead probably the local share actually absorbs all of that fare revenue loss. Now, I put an asterisk there because for two things. One, federally, with the COVID relief bills, the FTA is helping us through the COVID crisis and the reduced ridership. So we right now have limited fare revenues, and the FTA is helping us with that. But then, when that's gone, that will be gone. So we're in a better situation, I would say, federally than we typically are. Conversely, as I mentioned at the last TPBB, the state revenues and support, which makes up about 30% of our budget, or other, has been cut in half, or has been proposed to be cut in half. And so right now, if we eliminate those two dynamic factors right now and just assume that 2022 or 2023 will be similar to 2019, those are the challenges that exist. The document goes into a lot of scenarios about fare box and how much do we really eliminate, when we eliminate fare collection. And so basically, the blue in the graph in the far left represents our fares. The orange represents past partnerships, route partnerships, and then H&C paratransit. And so if we eliminate the blue, then the best case scenario is that we're, I think, at roughly about $9 million short. The worst case scenario is that our past partnerships and our route partnerships kind of go away because they say, well, why should we help subsidize you when these trips are for free? One thing that's also somewhat difficult, I'm going to go back to the previous one. These are not insurmountable, but they're significant challenges. Is that when we look at the blue portion of this graph, the local share, the majority of that local share represents Madison. But Madison Metro is not Madison. Metro Transit is not Madison. Metro Transit is 11 partners, which include Fitchburg and Sun Prairie and University of Wisconsin and, Middleton, Fitchburg, and, all these, UW Health. And so it's not so much that just Madison has to be willing to accept, the elimination of the fair revenues and just absorb it. But all of our partners, our group of 11 friends, let's call it a group of 11 partners, have to say, yes, we are all willing to accept the elimination of fares. Because a person, it's not really, we can't say, well, we'll charge fares in Middleton, but we won't charge fares when that bus gets into Madison, right? It's a system, and we have to kind of act like a system. We have to, and since we don't have an RTA, we have to move together as a group in most instances. So fare free in Madison, we have strong existing ridership. Our fares make up a large budget share. We typically have limited capacity during peak hours. 2019, that would be true. And if we were to return to our ridership in 2019, if we were to eliminate fares, it would be fair to say that we would have an increase in ridership. There are some offsetting cost opportunities. We could go lump sum, reduce the cost of collection, and we still have a net gap of, I guess, 7.5 to 17.4 million. The fare-free period we did have during summer 2020, which led to security complaints. That is, right now, I know that is due to anecdotal descriptions from drivers. There's been a request to actually do a comparison of the number of complaints, and I'm unsure of what the status is of that right now. There are some possible mitigation measures. We could do a vehicle registration fee. We could do a levy limit referendum. We could do a transportation utility fee. And we could also look at service reductions. So the vehicle registration fee is a legitimate thing, and the city of Madison implemented it in 2020 or 2021. We have one of the larger ones in the state. However, many of our municipal partners chose not to implement that. So for instance, Fitchburg decided not to do it. Sun Prairie does not do it. Middleton does not do it. And some of our partners like UW Health or UW Madison, that's not an avenue to help offset the fees. There could also be the opportunity to do a levy limit referendum statewide where, we'd say we'd like to release the levy limits. That would be a challenging referendum that would require a fair amount of effort, and there'd have to be kind of the political will statewide to do that. A transportation utility fee is an interesting option. Some cities are doing that, like Neenah is doing that. Weston, Wisconsin is doing that. Some of our council feels like we can't necessarily call it a utility fee, but there is an opportunity to do a transportation fee. In some ways, it's very similar to the vehicle registration fee, except that it might also capture commercial properties. But then again, we have 11 partners, and so that option would be available for some of our partners, but it wouldn't be available for all of our partners if we were to go fare free. And then the last option, which is really legitimate, is that we could just say we're going to reduce our service by about 24%. And if we reduce our service, by 24%, we could go fare free. Some of our facilities, we might have more buses than we need, and we might have a little bit more facilities than we need, but it's an option. I think some of the considerations are, one is, are any of these imminent? Meaning, could they be implemented right away? And I'm going to say that the vehicle registration fee could be implemented this year. However, it probably may not be implemented by all of our partners, and it's not available to some of our partners. And then the second thing is that, there's the opportunity cost of expanding service. So if we were able to find, let's say that $7 million or $10 million on an annual basis to replace fares, would it be better to eliminate fares, or would it be better to expand service? Right now, due to the COVID crisis or pandemic, Metro Transit had to scale back service in several parts of the city. Owl Creek, Route 19 down to Allied Drive, Route 38, all these things. And in a lot of the staff's mind is that if we had extra money, there might be more value in serving some of the areas that are no longer served due to the pandemic before we start to eliminate fares. So that's, a staff perspective, but, there are some parts of the city where people say transit service is great. We don't need any more. But I think more frequently we hear transit service isn't as good as it needs to be and we need more. And so if we had, let's say we had $10 million, we could take that $10 million and say, all right, we'll go fare free and keep the service the same. Or we could say, if we had $10 million, we could expand service to these areas of the city that currently are saying they don't have enough or any at all. So right now, the fare free in Madison, it's not recommended by staff. Feel like there may be other methods to reduce barriers. We could expand, low income passes, we could expand passes to youth like we are this summer. And there are other ways that perhaps we could accomplish some of those same objectives. And then, as I mentioned, the additional funding might be better spent enhancing service to areas like on Sprecher Road that no longer has service, or Owl Creek that no longer has service, or Route 19 that got cut to Allied Drive. So now I'm gonna do a little bit of a pivot. Okay, so I talked about fare free, and I believe this will there'll be a public meeting associated with this, and I think we're planning to have a public hearing with the TPB on this. Now we kind of pivot. So the first question is, do we collect fares? Okay, and so that is its own legitimate question, and that's a policy decision, right? If we choose not to collect fares, do we either increase the revenue or decrease the service? But let's say if we choose to continue to collect fares, how do we collect them? Right now we have a system that is based on some technology that's aging, and it's doesn't integrate well with other types of things. We basically have three. If we choose to collect fares, there's three basic types. There's a traditional fare box, which is what we have. There's the account-based, which I'll discuss a little bit about, and then there's the proof payment. So the traditional fare box is you pay when you get on board. The account-based is where you have a card that has money or trips on it, and you can use that card, and that card is associated with your name. You can load it or unload it. And then the proof of payment is more of you get a ticket, right? And if you get on board, if you have a ticket, and then occasionally there's inspectors out to just make sure that you have a ticket when you're on board. So I just skipped, 10 slides that Justin went through in the previous presentation in May, because Justin has a better handle on that than I do. But a lot of the considerations of that are in the memo that's in Leslie's. Staff recommends an account-based system on all Metro services. I think we feel like when we have BRT and the regular Metro service, we would like it to be seamless. We wouldn't like them to be two different animals, but kind of the same system integrating. Staff does feel like we have to have mitigation for cash collection. It allows a uniform system for all. It would allow all door boarding on all routes. So if you notice in the summer of 2020, we had rear door boarding and we didn't have front door boarding. If we had an account-based system, we could have had rear door boarding and front door boarding. Then it allows new techniques or technologies. So this is the, as mentioned, if we were to move to an account-based system, there would need to be some mitigation for the unbanked, people that do not have access to a bank account or I want to say a virtual type of money harbor. So of the things that can and should be considered would be to create a half fare low income program with post-pay negative balance. Meaning you would allow negative balances. Leverage a robust retail network. So the idea is that perhaps you're unbanked, but you might be able to get an account card, let's say at Walgreens or at a gas station or something to that effect. Continue cash on board for local routes. The idea, there's no benefit of an account-based system. And then the idea is that the phase out of that would kind of be phased out after 5 years. Right now we have a system, gen fare systems on our buses, and eventually I think those would be phased out. There wouldn't be cash on BRT. However, there would be at some of the stations, not all of them, we have 31 BRT stations, but on some of them, there would be the opportunity to use cash to reload account-based cards. So these are some of the, let's say, mitigation factors that could be considered and should be considered if we're to move to an account-based system. Now, there are some, I think, significant benefits to an account-based system in that you get fare capping. And that, right now, the best rate per ride is if you buy a monthly pass, right? And if you buy a monthly pass, you may pay $60. I can't remember how much they are, $60. But you get unlimited number of rides. The hard thing is that some customers might not have $60, right? And so while the $60 fee might be their best value, they don't have it, or two, they think I'm not going to use the bus that much. Right? Well, if you use an account-based system, what you can do is you can automatically convert that user to the best ride value. So instead of, they start off $2 a ride, but then when they get to 10 rides, they get the 10 ride rate, right? And then when they get to a certain amount, they get the monthly rate, right? Limit can be daily, weekly, or monthly. Weekly caps drive weekend ridership, which actually would be good because weekend ridership, we tend to have lower volumes on our buses on the weekends. We're still providing the service. Replaces the need for passes. Cap typically set at a pass rate. And as I mentioned, it benefits those who can't afford the pass. It lessens the sunk cost mentality of a pass. Whereas if you've got $60 in your pocket and it's June 1st, am I really going to use the bus that much this year? I don't know if I want to sink $60 towards the pass or not. This would result in a reduction of revenue. And so I guess we kind of acknowledge that, but it's really kind of, it's right for our customers, right? So if we look towards providing the best value to our customers, it's a good thing. So of the fare collection, the first question is, do we collect fares, right? Which is a policy issue. And then the second question is, if we collect fares, how do we collect them, right? So the staff are recommending an account-based system using all door tap readers on all routes. Use unlimited half fare and negative balance for low income with registration. Develop a robust retail reload network. Have a couple of kiosks where they could actually use cash to reload their cards. Temporarily use cash on board on our local routes, but the understanding that would be phased out over 5 years. Use weekly and daily fare capping. If we were to use an account-based system, we would be able to use mobile payments so people could use their phone. We'd have to integrate this with other ID cards. City of Madison has ID cards. UW has, they distribute certain ID cards to 30,000 people, right? We could implement 2-hour transfer periods, limited single-use paper cards, integrate this with paratransit, and open payments with contactless cards. And so the idea is that I think Metro was experimenting with that right before the pandemic, where instead of using a card that swipes, you just use a proximity cards, and it just goes a lot quicker. Next steps, as mentioned, we propose to have a public information meeting on July 21st, and then a public hearing on August 2nd. And then right now we're waiting on kind of the next steps from the attorney's office. I believe that the TPBB has the authority to recommend policy to the council, but can't necessarily implement the policy themselves. And so we're just asking for that confirmation from the attorney's office as to how this moves through the process. So there, I just kind of gave a presentation that Justin would be better suited to give, but I think it's good to get this out there in the public discussion arena sooner. And then you can ask a question and I'll either give you a very general answer or write it down and get back to you.
All right, thank you, Tom. We do have one registered for public comment. Bob Schaefer, looks like you're still with us. So you may begin when you're ready. You've got 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. It's interesting to listen to all of this, and that basically, from my recollection and going to the BRT meetings, that the primary reason for considering fare free is to speed up the loading of BRT buses, where every second counts. One of the things that isn't taken into consideration is that when we look to the fare free and the community has to pay for it, that the number of our low income people who start work or end work after the normal buses are moving, that they have no alternative but to use private or automobile transportation. And So that, but yet if we move this into the city funding, which is only going to be done either by vehicle registration or by taxes, that in both situations, the low income people will be severely affected by that, because whether it's through rent or home ownership, they'll be paying more taxes, and in order to drive their vehicle back and forth to work, they'll have to pay the vehicle registration fees. That the other side of that coin is that Madison keeps on looking at the number of trips that are being made. It's ridership. And what hasn't been taken into consideration, I've mentioned this before, is that the ridership calculation has not taken into consideration the population increase. So that if the population increases by half-fold and the ridership remains about the same, that the ridership in reality, based on the per person available to use it, is dropping. And we have to look at some of this data in order to make good decisions. And we need to look at not just making the BRT successful by cutting all the corners, but the BRT can only be successful if it's something that people are freely choosing to do because it's their best thing. I would venture to say that of the people who are receiving free passes, that some of them may be in the $80,000 to $100,000 or more a year income bracket, but yet these people are being able to ride free, while the lower income people are also having to end up paying for their trips through the taxation or through the vehicle registration. I think that we need to look at it. If a transportation mode is of value, then it needs to be paid for by the people who are using it. And
Bob, that's time. If you could wrap up quickly.
Okay, I'm done.
All right, thank you. Any questions for the speaker? All right, seeing none, questions for staff? Chris, go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks, Tom. I just wanted to clarify something that I think you presented implicitly, but just wanted to sort of wrap my head around it for sure. So when we talk about the fare revenues at around 14 million, that's fare box, and that's around 25%. But then this study also looked at the route partnerships, which is another 3 or 4 million. So that gets us to closer to 17 million, assuming that basically the notion is that if we make ridership fare free, then there's a good chance that partners wouldn't buy into a system that's free. So what I think what this is saying is that between the two of those, that actually covers closer to 30% of expenses.
I'm not sure if I can, if I understand or if I'm there. So
let me put it another way. The revenues listed in the report are about 12 million for passes and pass partnerships, and then another 4 million for route partnerships. And that route partnerships number pushes us from 13 to 17 or 18.
Yeah, perhaps. I'm going to use, since Randy's here, I'm going to use Fitchburg as an example. So, we have an agreement with Fitchburg to provide service to a certain area. And so it costs a certain amount of money to provide these routes, right? And so what Fitchburg does is Fitchburg pays us the money for those routes, less the fares, less the federal, and less the state, right? And so So yeah, and that it's a little bit convoluted because we don't have an RTA, right? So we have to have strong, I want to say strong friendships. And so our friendship or our partnership with Fitchburg is that this is, we pay our bus drivers this much to go on these roads. And we think that it's important to provide service on these roads. And this is in your city. And so you pay for that, but we distribute the federal funding in proportion, the state funding in proportion, and the fares collected on that in proportion. And I'll be honest, as we present the bills to all of our municipal partners, they never say, this is too low, we should pay you more. Because they are under the same constraints that we are. You know what I mean? Every year we have this levy limit that's really hard. And so any time a service increases, they have to find a way to get that money. And does that mean reducing staff hours or eliminating other types of services? And so, everyone who's been through our budget meetings in November realizes the incredible pressure that Madison faces, and Middleton and Sun Prairie and Fitchburg and all these other municipalities feel the same pressure. And so, if we were to eliminate fares, then they would have to. That just adds to the ways that they have to find how to get that money in the environment of levy limits.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I was oversimplifying it, but that was helpful.
All right. Any additional questions for Tom? Other comments on the presentation? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Tom. We'll move on to our final item for the evening then, Legistar 66137, parking ordinance changes update. We're going to get a presentation by board members Chris McCahill and Grant Foster.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen.
Thank you, Chris.
Yep. Okay, so this should be brief, maybe even briefer than the last time I spoke, although there might be more discussion. So basically, there's a small sort of working group, I guess, of folks that's been tackling this question of parking policy in the city, specifically on-street parking, but not in a universe of its own, and wrestling with questions about what are the issues that we're trying to achieve through parking policy, which is a long list, and then what are the policy levers we have to get there, which, depending on how state laws are interpreted, might be a shorter list, but a part of the goals is to work through that process and figure out how to achieve what it is we're trying to achieve through parking policy. So through this group, we landed on basically laying out the high-level parking issues, and this is how we see them. The first is that parking competes with other uses for available public space. So parking doesn't live separately from competition for bike lanes, travel lanes, trees, parklets. There's competition for available public space. Secondly, within the world of parking, there's competing demands for that parking. So this is, I think, a fairly comprehensive list, although maybe not entirely. Residents, businesses, service providers and guests, including personal guests and caretakers and that sort of thing. Commuters who are often parking on street during the day, and then special events, construction, street cleaning, and all the other uses throughout the day and throughout the year. And then parking policy has other implications, and this is mainly growing out of the sort of research look that I presented at the last meeting, or meeting before that, I forget now, and in how parking is related to other broad city goals. So it influences how people get around the city. It influences where development occurs and what development looks like. It influences how Madison looks at and feels. And I think I've even left some things off of here, including some equity issues and others. But really, the goal of policy then should be to strike a balance between these competing interests, competing demands, and achieving the right policy goals. So in trying to make sense of this, we've actually honed in on Tenny Lapham for now, for several reasons. I think it doesn't, this area as a case study doesn't really fully address all of the issues and opportunities with parking policy, but it does potentially serve as a good nexus for thinking about some of the more critical ones. So for example, it has limited off-street parking, including there's many older homes that were built before there was even any off-street parking available. So as parking becomes more scarce on street, that puts more pressure on those folks that are reliant on the parking and have been since their buildings were constructed. There's critical on-street parking needs in this area. There's a fairly high permit parking rate in terms of how many people are buying on-street parking permits. There are commuter parking pressures, or at least in areas that they weren't addressed through the current RP3 program. There's major development, which I think is one of the key points that makes this a critical area. Obviously, we all know that this has gone from being pretty lightly developed to densely developed in just a matter of a decade. That leads to things like RP3 exemptions. So a lot of new buildings do not get access to on-street parking or through the RP3 program. And the map on the right shows sort of the concentration of buildings, little red X's of where those are. And then large events, particularly those at Breeze Stevens Field. So clearly very dynamic on-street parking competition needs. We also have interested stakeholders. So Alder Heck is someone that our group has been sort of talking pretty closely with our group, expressed interest in working through some of these challenges, along with the Tenny Lapham Neighborhood Association. And for anybody who knows the history of looking at on-street parking a little bit, it was kicked off largely by Alder Zellers, who was in this district before, and motivated the MOPS parking study. So what we're sort of proposing is some next steps to use Tenny Lapham with buy-in from the neighborhood as a test case to understand what parking policy could look like and understand what's possible. So next steps would be neighborhood outreach with TLNA, study parking use in the area to really understand how parking is being used, and work with city staff and common council to develop a neighborhood parking management program, sort of a pilot program, which other cities have done. So just a refresher on how Madison currently manages on-street parking, basically through 4 mechanisms, through metered parking, through the RP3 program, which lets residents, which limits parking 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday to 1 or 2 hours, unless you have a residential permit. The RPO program, in which case half of the block is reserved only for permitted residents from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And that's not very heavily used. And then there's also the Clean Streets, Clean Lakes program and snow emergencies, in which case certain blocks would be limited 1 day at a time, or alternate side parking would be enforced during snow emergencies. So So that's sort of the current system that we're working within. And I'll just point out here that the Tenny Lapham area that we're talking about, which is here, it does have one of the higher permit parking rates in terms of issued permits to available on-street spaces, but it's not as high as you might think. And I think this points to one of the potential issues that we've uncovered in talking through some of these issues is that the permits, the residential parking permits, are really only meant to enforce, to protect against commuter parking during the day. So in an area like Tenny Lapham, where a lot of the competing interests are probably residents, competing residents for public parking at night, the permit program doesn't really do any good for them. So outside of those 8 to 6 time periods, it's really a free-for-all, which means people might not be as interested in those permits as you think. There's also, I'll just remind you, you've seen this before, but there's proposed TDM. So this would require developers to mitigate new car trips. Larger projects with more parking would have to achieve more mitigation points. And this table is just showing what those mitigation points look like. So the more parking you provide, the larger your building, the more points you have to earn. And those points can be earned through any number of measures, including active transportation investments, information and communication around transportation options, et cetera. I think folks should be familiar with this by now. And those mitigation points also include some parking specific ones, including shared parking, pricing parking, unbundling parking, which means folks would pay separately for parking from their lease, and parking cash out, in which case employers could get cash back if they refuse parking. So this is currently in the works to address some issues around basically off-street parking through levers that would apply to developers. So we're thinking about on-street parking in the context of this that's happening off-street. So just to get ourselves thinking around what might be possible and some types of programs that we could explore through this neighborhood management program. We looked at several other cities, a key one being Northwest Portland, Oregon. They established an advisory committee in 2014 to sort of work through what we're talking about here, work through some of the, understand the issues, understand the opportunities, and create a good parking management program. Obviously, it's taken time for them to work through that. But their final program is what's shown in the picture on the right, where they have areas that are pay to park only, pay to park with residential exemptions, visitor time limits, et cetera. So a pretty dynamic system depending on what the competing needs are on any given street or neighborhood. They have a cap on the total number of permits they issue, which is something I think worth exploring for us. And then also fewer permits for newer buildings. So for example, a building built very recently would only be able to request 0.4 parking permits per residential unit. They have opt-out incentives. So if you opt out of getting a parking permit, you can get other sort of commuter benefits. Businesses are allowed to get permits. And then another key part of this is there's a surcharge for the permits where the revenues go right back. The revenues are committed to projects in that area. So basically what this does is says to folks, you're buying into this parking management system, but some portion of that money is going to, we guarantee you, is going to be spent on projects in your neighborhood. Arlington, Virginia, they limit permits wherever there's off-street parking already available. So that clearly has some appeal in certain cases here. So for example, if you have off-street parking, you might only be able to get half the number of on-street parking permits. There's tiered pricing where the first vehicle costs a certain amount, the second vehicle that you want to permit costs more, and then that ramps up to sort of discourage folks from requesting permits for a large number of vehicles. They have flex passes where you can buy a permit that doesn't actually apply to any particular car, but it's a permit that you would hold and could use however you want, such as for visitors. And landlord passes, there are landlord passes available. A couple Wisconsin examples we looked at, mainly because it sort of lets us test the waters on what might be possible within the fairly restrictive Wisconsin context. Milwaukee has overnight parking permits, which is a way of managing parking overnight. So this is between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. So unless you have a permit, you could be ticketed for leaving a car on a street overnight. Which is potentially a way to address competition among residents. And in La Crosse, they have a similar overnight parking prohibition. And then they have an ordinance for parking benefit districts. And this is the same sort of program that I described that they have in Northwest Portland, where revenues that are spent on parking in that district would go back to district improvements. Again, even though we've found these examples all over the place, we would have to explore what would work in Madison, but we want to sort of fully understand the range of possibilities and examples. So that's all I've got, I think, to present here, and we are looking for some feedback from the board on anything we presented here and thoughts on moving forward. And I'm happy for Alder Foster to weigh in too if I missed anything.
We do have one registrant for public comment. Thank you, Chris. And thanks to both of you for continuing to work on this. The registrant is Bob Schaefer. So Bob, I see you're still with us. You know the drill, you got 3 minutes. You may begin when you're ready. Are you there, Bob?
Unmuted, somebody.
There we go.
I thought I was unmuted, but I must have got muted again. Anyhow, parking has always been a situation, especially in denser areas. And I think one of the problems with that is that when the developers present the plan to the planning department, that they possibly do not consider the amount of parking that their residences will generate. And so therefore things fall short. Sometimes the parking spaces are available, but that because the management charges additional for that parking, more than what they would cost for the pay of the city, that then people are spreading out into the city rather than being able to park in their residential place. So I don't know exactly what the answer would be, but I think that something needs to be to take advantage of the available parking that may be present in that area, but not being used because of the cost. So that's just in looking at the maps that were presented, that would be my logical conclusion. And just to make a comment, I just sent you all an email demonstrating the cost for Madison Metro according to their summary report for 2019. 49 million is what the costs were when you look at the cost per hour. And I'm done.
All right, thank you, Bob. Are there any questions for the speaker? All right, seeing none, questions for Chris or Alder Foster? Or feedback as well on the progress they've made so far, and then also feedback or commentary on the direction that we'd like to see them continue or to move forward in. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, so this might be way out of order, and if it is, I apologize. Chris, in the La Crosse 1 hour overnight parking, I didn't fully understand that. Could you explain what that 1 hour overnight parking was in La Crosse?
Yeah, so I might be mixing up Milwaukee and La Crosse, but I think in La Crosse, it's a straight up overnight parking ban. So between, let me see what my slide says. Oh, so it's between the hours of 2 a.m. and 8 a.m. There's a 1 hour limit. So that would mean that wouldn't prevent you from parking, but it would let the city basically enforce if folks were leaving their car entirely overnight.
Alder Foster, go ahead.
Thank you. Just wanted to highlight, I think, a couple of key points that have come out for me over the course of this work. One of them is, as we looked at some specific geographies in Madison and what's going on today and what how the current parking regulations are addressing the parking issues, I think I was very surprised that there's probably not a great match in a number of places between what the actual issues are and the kind of the RP3 program, which is our general approach to solving those issues. We looked at some of the further out kind of like west side districts that have RP3 in place and started looking at number of permits in the different areas. And it's really, it does not seem that our current process is really dialing in and addressing the issues that RP3 was designed to. So in some places, it looks like residents may request an RP3 program more just to not have people parking on their streets, and not so much because they're actually having issues parking themselves, for example. When we dug into Tenny Lapham and speaking with Alder Heck and some of the feedback he's received, you know, we've got the RP3 program there, but as Chris mentioned in the presentation, overnight parking and evening parking with events is perhaps the bigger frustration and challenge in that neighborhood. And again, RP3 is not going to really address that. So just wanted to call that out as why we really wanted to dig into one specific neighborhood and make sure we're first understanding what the parking issues are before we come up with recommendations and solutions. Because I think historically we kind of came up with, oh, we've got an RP3 program, let us know if you want it. We had kind of one tool. People say, hey, I've got these parking issues. Well, here you go, here's your tool. And from the initial research that we've done in Madison, it does not look like it's been a very good fit. So that's one thing. And then the second is, I think we've also early on had been looking at, well, what can we do from a legal perspective? What can we do? What can't we do? And we really wanted to take a step back from that approach. And again, focus in on identifying what the issues are, coming up with potential solutions based on what other communities are doing, and then testing the legal framework and seeing if there's any obstacles to us implementing those. Because as we press the attorney's office a little bit, it does seem like there may be more flexibility within the state legal framework. So we really wanted to focus first on what we think would work, rather than just asking, what can we do? And I think the last thing I would point out is in that Portland example, as well as the La Crosse ordinance, I think one key element of those that is very interesting is bringing some of that benefit back to the neighborhoods that are most impacted. So that's something that we really want to take a look at with the Tenny Lapham area. I think it's helpful for those that are experiencing these parking issues and challenges to number one, to be participating, and number two, to feel like they're getting some benefit out of that parking regulation, rather than just feeling like, well, parking stinks around here and there's nothing I can do about it. In Portland, for example, you can use that benefit to get subsidized bus pass or bike share passes. So yes, you're living in an area that has a lot of parking pressure. We acknowledge that, and you get some benefit in return. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to point out from what we've learned so far.
Thank you, Alder Foster. Are there any further comments, thoughts, recommendations? Of course, if you think of things after the meeting, you can always let Chris or Alder Foster know. Something we'll be seeing again, of course. All right, seeing no further comments, thank you both for continuing to work on this. And that's all we have for the evening. So I would entertain motions to adjourn.
Move adjournment.
Thank you, Alder Furman. There's a motion. Is there a second? Second, Chris McCahill. All those in favor of adjourning tonight's meeting, please unmute yourselves and say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, no. Sounds like we're unanimous. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. We're adjourned.